Hello, it's Michael Waits again, and welcome to AGTP Daily, where we cover the most consequential, most interesting, and most compelling tech news of the day in the US and globally. Today is Tuesday, the 10th of February, 2026, and as always, there's a lot to cover today. I wanted to go over two things today. I want to go over Anthropic, but I want to go over it in the context of the AI industrialization and CapEx conversation that we had yesterday. And I want to talk about OpenClaw because I think OpenClaw is going to have an impact at scale on what's going on in the agentic AI space. So let's start with Anthropic first. Yesterday we framed the AI CapEx boom. I don't know. There's for some reason whenever I say AI and CapEx, I want to say API. Anyway, bear with me. Yesterday we framed the AI CapEx boom, and we trusted it all made sense. It was this concept that I had that it was going to be more like railroads and it was going to be like SaaS. But I want to get into it again just to go over it. If for some reason you haven't seen yesterday's episode, big tech is spending like a nation state to build AI infrastructure, and tech stocks are reacting like they don't think it's such a great idea to have all these upfront costs and maybe not a lot of short-term return. And the real economy is still stuck asking, who actually benefits from all of this investment? And today I want to follow up with just a slightly sharper lens because the CapEx story is the hardware layer of the AI era, and the model story is the software layer. I think that makes the most sense. And the software layer is going to be the one that decides who wins. We'll get into that in a little bit as well. And that brings us to Anthropic's new model, Claude OPUS 4.6, announced on February 5, 2026. I want to cover four topics. And the one through line is that infrastructure is only valuable if a model can turn that infrastructure into durable, defensible outcomes. In other words, I can build all this infrastructure, but if it's just an investment in infra and it doesn't lead to any positive or any kind of outcomes, what was the point? Okay, let's do it. The real question behind this AI CapEx, I did it. I got it. I didn't say API this time. What is actually being bought? And here's the truth about AI spending. Not all compute is equal. There's compute that produces capability, and there's compute that produces a bill. And the thought that I have, just to make this really easy, is what is compute? Let's go backwards. What is compute that produces a bill? I could buy the highest powered computer, just simplistically, for a 4-year-old. And unless that 4-year-old is a prodigy, the outputting capability is not going to be that high. But if I buy that same computer for somebody who actually knows what to do with it and who has an idea about what to do with it, has a plan, and that plan gets executed properly, well, then that's going to produce some great outcomes and some capability. And that's the real difference here, right? So don't think that all compute is equal. So when you hear hundreds of billions of AI infrastructures being invested, don't picture this as just one individual single race. I think you have to think about this in the context of two races are happening at once. Building capacity, which I mentioned earlier, right? GPUs, data centers, power, and networking, or building advantage. And I think this is where the real outcomes are: distribution, workflow ownership, trust, and enterprise integration. And to be fair, again, just to make it easy to understand, I could go out if I could borrow the money or if I just had the money lying around and I could buy GPUs, I could build data centers, I could connect it to power, and I could network all of my data centers together. But if I don't know what to do with it and I don't have distribution, if I don't own the workflows and I can't integrate it into enterprises, well, then I'm just building capacity. And that capacity at some level ends up being kind of useless, right? And it's the second one, it's this build advantage that turns CapEx into a moat. And that is why the market has been jittery, I would say. You can see it, right? And investors have looked at this cycle and they've asked, are you building the next cloud? Or are you rebuilding the airline industry? Expensive capacity with no pricing power, right? So again, I could start an airline tomorrow. I think it was Richard Branson who famously said, how to become a millionaire. Step one, become a billionaire. Step two, start an airline. Anyway, no insult intended to the airlines and my friends in the airline business. And that's why model announcements like the announcement of Claude OPUS 4.6 really matter. This model is going to tell us whether the spend is turning into better software economics, better enterprise outcomes, and eventually better pricing power. This is the idea, right? I mean, all businesses at some level are about, what are my margins? Right? So if you're running a business like a grocery store, let's say we have 2% margins, it's a business, but it's not a great business. Or you can be running a business that has an 85% margin. That's a great business. And that brings us to Anthropic. And our second thing, what did Anthropic actually ship? And why 1 million tokens is a strategic weapon. Anthropic said that Cloud OPUS 4.6 is an upgrade to what was its existing smartest model with major improvements in coding, agentic work, operating reliable inside of large code bases, and code review debugging, including catching its own mistakes. This is kind of cool, right? Because there are all these Q&A teams out there that are doing this code review debugging stuff. I've spoken to some software companies that have massive teams that are doing this. And it's important that they feel like Opus can actually do this inside of the software development process. This is actually super cool. But the headline that should make every enterprise lean forward and think really hard is this. It introduces a 1 million token context window in beta for Opus class models. And here's why that's not just a bigger number. Okay. It's a change in what the model can be. Because long context, this is why this is so important, right? You don't want to have this short context. And as a matter of fact, my business partner and I were talking about this yesterday. The way that these models actually use context is actually super important. And the long context isn't about just stuffing more text into a prompt. It's not just about jamming more information. It's about something way more important, I believe. Can the model hold a complex thought or a complex world in its head? In the same way that I can have a conversation with you today and literally 3 months later, and you can hold that thought, and it can be a very complex conversation that you and I are having. Excuse me. And then 3 months later, if we don't meet each other and if we don't discuss that again, when I come back to you and say, remember that conversation we had on February 10th about this thing, that thing, and the other thing? And you say yes, and you're just right back into the conversation. I may have to give you a couple of cues to remind you, but you're going to stay coherent long enough to finish the thought and to finish the conversation with me. And this is the same thing with these models. Can it stay coherent long enough to finish the job? Or do you have to go back and reprompt and reprompt and reprompt to make sure that the output is going to be the output that you expect, and more importantly, the output that you want? Excuse me. Anthropic calls this content rot, the tendency for models to drift away or to forget or degrade as just this world that we're building inside of the context that we're creating for the model continues to grow. And at some point, maybe it just becomes too much for it to handle. And that's why this million token context is actually really important. And the claim here is that Opus 4.6 performs markedly better on long context retrieval and understanding and remembering. This is actually super important. Let's add this second piece into this as well. Anthropic's platform docs also highlight adaptive thinking. So it can change the way it feels about things, where the model dramatically decides when and how much to think, right? So I use another provider of AI, and I actually have to tell it explicitly, no, 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 think harder about this. I have to switch inside the model from just give me an instantaneous answer as opposed to take some time. Right, and I do this all the time, again, with humans. I love to make this analogy between the technology that we use and the way it behaves and the way humans behave. Because when we talk about AGI, right, artificial general intelligence, we're trying to create or recreate the way humans handle their own intelligence and their own context. And I think that's really important to note. So this idea about adaptive thinking actually becomes really important. It decides when and how much to think on its own, rather than just blindly applying some kind of fixed reasoning mode or some fixed model, which a lot of the LLMs do right now. Right, and maybe they'll change, but again, they're claiming that they're very far ahead, and because of the larger context that you're allowed to give it, as we said before, this means that it can remember things and it can be more adaptive in its thinking about all these other things that it thinks it already knows, that lives inside that complex world that we discussed before. So let me see if I can give you a mental picture of what this is meant to look like, or what we can expect this to look like. Earlier models, right, were like a smart analyst who gets tired after page 30. Believe me, I worked and existed in the stock market for 20 something years. I was not an analyst, and I definitely was not a smart analyst, but I do remember getting tired after page 30. Maybe for me, it was getting tired after page 25. Let's do that. But this is closer to an analyst that can read the entire binder, the whole paper, the whole analysis, and keep the whole plot straight. I mean, I do you remember like reading a book, whether it's an analysis of a stock or just an entire book where you put the book down and you're like, where did I leave off? And essentially what they're saying here is that this model can read past page 30, metaphorically, keep the entire plot straight, whether it's a book or an analysis, as we were discussing, and then produce a better answer and still show its work. Right? And I think this is actually super important. Now, let's take that capability that we have. Now that we have this mental picture of what the model can do or what the expectations for what the model can do, now let's take that capability, which we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, because we believe that capabilities are important more than, actually at some level, more than the compute that creates that capability. But now let's do something interesting. And this will bleed, I think, into our second topic, which is agentic AI. And, and that's going to get really interesting too. But this, what does it do to agents? What happens when you can connect this million token context to an agent? Reuters, when I was reading an article in Reuters, they note that Anthropic's Claude code tool can distribute tasks among multiple autonomous agents. So it's almost like having 4 or 5 coders or developers, basically dividing work and executing it faster. And this is super cool, right? We used to say all the time when I was at Goldman Sachs, if we had one superstar coder, it was better than having like 5 middling coders. But in this case, maybe you have 5 superstar coders. And you can split the work up between all 5 of them, again, because Opus itself can distribute those tasks among multiple agents to do it. And this is where this stuff gets really interesting. So it's not just chat. But I've been using models now for 2 years, and it does feel like I'm talking to one person. And sometimes it feels like, particularly at the beginning, that I'm talking to a person who's distracted. I want to be able to try this model as well. And I haven't gone through all of it, but I want to be able to try it to see, are they getting distracted or are they getting past page 30? Right. And this is an early version, I think, of something big. It always is, right? Whenever we develop software, oh my. For those of you that don't remember, I started using a spreadsheet program called Lotus 123. And you could tell it was really powerful, but it was very basic and it was DOS based, not Windows based. And DOS was like this very sort of simplistic operating system. And you could only have one program running at a time. So if you were sitting in the spreadsheet, you could do spreadsheeting things, but you couldn't multitask. This was the big benefit that Windows brought, obviously. And then when Microsoft Excel came into Windows, now you could do all this. And you remember, I mean, at some point, Excel got bloated. Let's hope the models don't get bloated. But you knew when you were working in Excel, sometimes you had to do calculations or create your own functions. And then Excel said, don't worry about that. We'll create those functions and that functionality for you. And that's why, particularly in the development of this type of software, on the agentic side, but also on the model side, you always know that this is an earlier version of something that's going to get bigger, particularly if you've seen many software development cycles, which I have. And what is really going on here? It feels to me that artificial intelligence is an operating system for work, right? Where it's going to change the way a whole host, if not all of our work gets done, particularly if it's thought work. Right? And to be fair, it could also change the way that even industrial work gets done from a production standpoint, because you can teach a model through agentic to then be able to go out and do things. And again, we'll talk about that with OpenClaw a little bit later. And it also creates this idea of parallelism, right? We talked about it a few minutes ago. Instead of just giving a task for it to do once, or just one task to do it one at a time, you can give it a task to do, and then it can parse it out to 5 agents, 10 agents, whatever it are. And to be fair, those agents can then communicate with each other and be way more productive. And because of the context that it can understand and create, and we talked about this earlier, the claim here is that Opus 4.6 can then really debug in real time and check the coding that's being done, not just across one instance of this agent, but all 5 of them. And I'm just using 5 as a proxy for whatever number you want to use in this case. And that's where the CapEx story meets the model story. And I think that's why this is super interesting, okay? Because if models become reliable agents, and maybe we're not 100% there, and maybe we'll never be 100% there. I mean, even your smartest analysts coming out of your top universities, they get tired, right? And of course, AI doesn't get tired, but you understand the point. They're never 100% there. Maybe they're 98% there. Maybe they're 99% there, but we'll get there, right? And if the model becomes reliable agents, computing stops being infrastructure and starts becoming productive capacity, which is what we talked about at the beginning of this conversation. Are you building compute, or are you building the capacity to get things done reliably, effectively, and efficiently? And I think that's the real question here. Excuse me. Everybody remembers when Mark Andreessen said software is eating the world. And I think one of the reasons why this new model matters for the market is because AI is now eating software. And I don't think that back in the day anybody anticipated that something would eat the software that was eating the rest of the world. And even in the way that it is, it's probably not the way people think. And again, just something to keep in mind, the initial impression that we have of anything that's new, I won't say is always wrong, but it always needs to change and adapt and iterate at some point, right? Because your first impression, maybe it's fear, maybe it's amazement, maybe it's something, but it's always probably some combination of all those reactions. And I think that saying that AI is eating software, but not in the way that most people think, it's just more of an obvious statement than anything else. But again, getting back to some of the articles that I was reading in Reuters, it says that Anthropic's upgrade to a broader sell-off pressure on traditional software stocks because investors are trying to figure out, this gets back to that impact of the CapEx on the stock market that we talked about yesterday and what role Anthropic is playing here. Investors are trying to price like what happens when AI becomes good enough to replace parts of the software stack, right? Because one of the things they got right, one of the things that got introduced, if I remember correctly, was okay, you can now use this model not just to code, right? Not only to code, but maybe it can replace a legal analyst, right? And that's scary, but it's also hugely impactful. But in all cases, right, and as I was mentioning, right, this reaction of what does it mean that AI is eating software? And I think if you look at what happened in the market yesterday or the day before, some of the biggest companies that were getting impacted were SaaS companies because those are ones where you're paying them to develop this software for you, right? You don't have to make any investment yourself in the software or in the servers potentially. And all this stuff happens for the most part on the back end. But what if you could do it yourself at speed and have agentic AI kind of take over some of these tasks and that the model that you're using already knows how to use some of this functionality. And like I said, the way when we say that AI is eating software, everybody's first impression is not necessarily the right impression. It's not the way you think. It's way more nuanced, and I think it always is. Right? This is the thing that we have to understand. AI doesn't just kill the software. It changes the unit of value, right? And the old software value was, or and maybe even the existing one up until now was feature sets. What does it do? What does it excuse me, what does it help you accomplish? Why are you buying it? And then there were dashboards. Okay, I'm doing all these things, but what is the output? What is the outcome? How can I see it in a consolidated way? How can that dashboard tell me about not just what I'm accomplishing, but what I would like to accomplish and where I want to go? Am I hitting my KPIs? Right, I need to know. And then it was workflows and click through. I actually helped develop some trading software, not writing the code, but sitting down and understanding when I was at Goldman Sachs, what is the workflow that I want? And what are the clicks that I need to do this? And that was great. But the interface and the UI really made, and the UX to be fair, really, really made a difference. And one of the things that my business partner and I were talking about yesterday was at the end of the day, agentic AI doesn't care what the UI looks like. I'll get to this in a second as well. It just doesn't care. So a lot of software that's getting developed now in the AI space has a UI, but the UI is terrible. And I think the idea here is we need to have a UI because some people are just going to be more comfortable clicking around on their own and have not yet understood how they can use agentic AI to kind of bypass the UI and say, I can still be super productive, but I just needed AI connectivity to the software that I actually want to use. The model doesn't know like which software it's going to use, but if you point it in the right direction, give it access to the right APIs, then it can go out there and do things for you without a care in the world about what that user interface looks like. It doesn't care because it's almost like machine language for a computer. It doesn't care what the operating system is. It's going right to the machine and saying, here's the thing that I want you to do. And it completely bypasses it. It doesn't care. I think that's part of the thing here. So how can we simplify this? The new software value becomes outcomes, right? What do I want the outcome to be? Automation. How can I automate it using an API, using API connectivity where I don't care what the user interface or what the software looks like to me or looks like to that agent. The agent doesn't care. It's not looking at it. It's just interacting with its functionality and some decision making that happens without you. And here's the thing that I think is actually really important. There are a lot of companies out there that talk about humans in the loop, and I don't think humans are going to go away from decision making. And you see this in the NFL all the time, right? Should I go for 4th and 1? And there's a whole set of analytics teams out there that say, if it's this situation and this thing and that thing and the other thing, well, then you should definitely go for 4th and 1. And I'm just thinking about this because the Super Bowl was a few days ago. And there were some questionable calls on 4th down. And we can argue until we're blue in the face about whether in football momentum matters, but sometimes you can feel like the analytics don't know if the defense is tired. The analytics doesn't know if it's snowing. The analytics doesn't know a lot of things. So in some cases, you are going to still want to have humans in the loop, but let's give it some percentage, 85% of the time, 90% of the time. It's going to be about what happens without you, decisions that get made without you, and that's actually really important. So the question isn't, and I'm just using Salesforce as a proxy. We can use any SaaS company you want. Insert your favorite company here. But Salesforce was just something that I was thinking about. AI is not going to replace it. The real question is, does the customer pay for software, or do they pay for results delivered by the agents inside the software? And I think this is a really important distinction. Again, in a way, I don't care how it gets done, as long as my burger is delicious, the cheese is perfectly melted, and the fries are perfectly crispy. I don't care how it gets done at some level. And I think this is the same with our software output. Because the UI and at some level the UX is not going to matter anymore, it's only going to be the model and the agents that I ask to go into this SaaS software to produce outcomes that I want and give me information that I want. And that's why investors were nervous yesterday, right? Because, excuse me, pricing power for these big companies shifts when AI becomes table stakes, particularly on the agentic side, right? And this is where OPUS 4.6 really comes into play. And if every company can buy an agent that drafts, analyzes, codes, and operates tools, then a lot of workflow software gets pressure tested. It really does, right? Because think about it. If I have a team, let's say I'm a small to medium-sized business, and I have a 15-person team, the sales team or whatever, that's acting with some SaaS. We don't need to use Salesforce anymore as a proxy for everything else, right? Because it's not the only place where this is going to be impacted. But now I can have analysts or salespeople or agents. I could have 100 of them, because the cost to me of implementing a new agent is probably less than the cost to me of hiring a new analyst to do this. And I think this is where things get really interesting. In the sense, so now what's going to happen? If every company, like I said, if every company can buy agents that draft, analyze, and do all this other stuff, these workflow software companies are really going to get pressure tested. And again, this is why the market was worried. And now you can see why Anthropic is not talking just about coding. Right? Because before you heard people talk about Claude in the context of, oh, it can code, it can vibe code, it can do this other stuff, but also everyday work tasks, right? We talked about workflow before. If you go all the way back to the beginning of the conversation, we said, are you building compute, or are you building outcomes and capacity to get things done? And this is including, if we just mentioned like everyday work tasks, right? Includes research and creating documents, spreadsheets, and presentations. Imagine just giving an agent or a bunch of agents the ability to work on a spreadsheet together, right? So you have shared Google Sheets, you have shared Google Docs, but imagine having agents being able to attack this, editing and working on this together. Excuse me, going out and doing research, putting all this stuff in different sections inside of let's say, of a Google Doc. You can be just way more productive. And if it can check its own work, that's kind of cool, right? And this is not subtle. It's a direct attack on the friction of white collar work. And it's going to be interesting to see what the outcome is on white collar work. And then there's cybersecurity. I actually ran into a guy yesterday at the gym who's in the cybersecurity business. This guy was exhausted. He's working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And he said to me, I couldn't even get motivated to come to the gym today. He works Asian hours and he also works US hours. The guy was exhausted. But this is the place where capability really becomes consequence, because failing at cybersecurity is failure at scale. And that's where things get really bad. And there's a Tech Radar report that says Anthropic is claiming that 4.6 helped identify 500 or more high severity vulnerabilities in open source software. Reasoning about code in a way more similar to human research than just like that than not. And that's actually super cool. And whether you take that number literally or directionally, it doesn't matter, right? It's just like what's the trend? The implication for this is pretty serious. When models get better at code, they get better at both building and breaking, right? So this is a two-way street. We always talk about this AI war, at least in the context of cybersecurity, of, well, if I'm building the cybersecurity, but you're trying to ruin my security, and we both have the same tools, it's not just about capability. It's about governance, monitoring, secure deployment, and knowing where your model is allowed to act. And that's why the winners won't just ship the smartest model. They'll ship the safest system. Cybersecurity super duper matters. It really does. That's why this guy is up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and is exhausted. Let's cover our fourth topic here. And that is which industries change first and what this means for other LLM providers. And let's land this properly. If OPUS 4.6 is really a step function improvement, if it's really as different and as great as Anthropic says it is in long context coherence, so like I said, understanding this complex world that's around it, careful planning, agentic task duration, which means that your agents can just go to work. I mean, they understand this long context, so they can do more work and be more productive. And also, they can also code reliability. Then there are some industries that are going to feel it first. And here's where I think it hits the earliest: cybersecurity and IT operations, finance and risk, legal and research heavy workflows. This is what we talked about, right? You have in the legal space, long context performance changes what's possible in due diligence, contract review, and multi-document understanding. I have 5 documents. I want to compare them all together. Instead of having the same person read all of them, again, I can have a bunch of different agents acting on them and have the agents communicate with each other and understand like this idea of I don't need now to have humans paging through mountains of docs. I can have agents doing this. It just makes people way more efficient. And again, what does it mean for paralegals? And what does it mean for first-year lawyers and lawyer analysts at some big firms? And software engineering at enterprise scale. This is a big deal, right? Because this is the one that's really obvious. Not just writing code, but navigating large code bases. One of the things we used to talk about when I was at Goldman Sachs was, I mentioned this idea of a superstar programmer earlier. One superstar programmer is better than 10 kind of middling ones, per se. And what if that guy or that gal leaves? Even if you hire another superstar programmer, that next person is going to come in and have to analyze all the code. They're going to have to go through it and understand. But imagine a situation where an agentic, you have a whole host of agents that code that are using Opus 4.6 and then there's 4.7 and 4.8, of course. They're not going to leave. And even if they did, even if the agents themselves died, whatever that means in the context of agentic AI, the ability for a new agent to be able to go through that software code base in real time is just way different than having a human go through it. And managing long running tasks is just going to become so much easier. Let's talk about what it means for the other LLM providers. Excuse me. So I think it raises 3 important questions, or it raises the bar, right? Context is no longer a feature, now it's a platform strategy. And if 1 million context, this is the thing we discussed at the beginning, becomes normal, the model becomes less dependent, right, on particular like coding pipelines and more capable of working inside the full problem. This is what we talked about. If I don't have to come back to you in 3 months and re-explain to you the complex world in which you're living, the complex conversation that we had, if agentic AI can go out and do this, if Opus 4.6 can go out and do this on its own, well, it's a game changer. And I mentioned this earlier in the conversation, but I think it's important to be explicit about it. The agents become the user interface, right? And I see this happening in my business as well. We talked about this yesterday, and it just changed the way I talked. It changed the way I thought, about the way agentic AI is operating inside of software, inside of these software platforms. And actually, one of the questions that I asked my business partner was, you just give it the API, and if the software that you're using has a highly effective API, well, then the agents can just go out and do stuff that you couldn't do at scale on your own. And that's where the agents themselves become the user interface. And that's why some of this new stuff that you see being developed out there, the UI is terrible. Okay, it's not terrible, but it's pretty bad. And you can tell that the software development companies have not spent a lot of time on building out the UI because in their minds, they know that agentic AI is going to be interacting with it, and the agentic AI doesn't care what the user interface looks like, right? And this moves from just like chat to orchestration. That's the way you have to think about it. You're orchestrating your interface with with the software that you're using, and you don't care what the UI looks like because the agents don't care what the UI looks like. And the last thing is that safety and reliability. This is true across all software stacks, become competitive advantages. If your software, right, has holes in it, and if it's easily hacked, well, then it's not safe and it's not reliable. And that's a problem. And as models act, enterprises will demand auditability and refusal behavior that they can trust at scale. Right? So you have to understand. You have to be able to understand what the agents are doing. You have to be able to audit it, and you have to be able to understand exactly what's going on. You don't want it to just be black boxish. And here's kind of a big thought that I want to end on here. And this conversation actually went on a little bit longer than I want to, but I do still want to get to OpenClaw if that's okay. We keep talking about artificial intelligence CapEx. I did it again. I'm so happy I didn't say API. Like it's a spending story, but it's not, right? And we talked about this a little bit yesterday. It's a control story. Whoever can control the velocity, whoever is building the velocity can then build the control. And I think this is super important because if you can combine the most scalable infrastructure with the most reliable agentic model embedded into the most important workflows, it doesn't just sell software. It becomes the operating layer of the economy, right? We talked about this. It's going to become the operating system of work. And if Claude 4.6 is another signal that this race is accelerating, it's not accelerating towards smarter chat. Don't think about it that way. But it's accelerating towards systems that can hold context, plan, act, and persist. And that happens when the industries that win won't be the ones that try AI. They'll be the ones that rebuild their workflows around it before their competitors do. And again, historically, this has always been true. If you understood how to use big data before other companies knew how to use it, well, then you were going to win. This is true across all sort of software development cycles and all technology implementations. Let's take a moment and think about OpenClaw. It feels like we need to talk about this, particularly after this entire conversation about agentic AI and how and I will say this, the agent actually doesn't care what model you're using, what model you give it. But this agentic AI is like a personal assistant that doesn't answer questions. It does things. And I think, again, this is actually this is like a deeper dive into some of the conversations we were having before about CapEx and the Anthropic model. But OpenClaw is saying, okay, what is it actually going to look like? How can you actually do all these things that we just discussed? OpenClaw can do a bunch of things. It can send emails. It can manage your calendar. It can check you in for flights. And this is what's kind of super cool. It does it in the context of tools you're already using. I use WhatsApp every single day to communicate with people across the board, both for business and privately. And if I can use OpenClaw inside of WhatsApp, I can just talk to it like I talk to a person. And in a way, that's really cool. I don't use Telegram because I'm not so involved in the Web3 world, but okay, it can do it from Telegram as well. I guess that allows you to buy and sell Bitcoin at scale. But it probably works in every chat app that you're already using. And this is another big benefit. I think companies have figured out they don't want to take you out of the context in which you're already comfortable. So putting me into WhatsApp, where literally before I started recording, I was texting a friend of mine. So I'm completely used to doing that. And if I can do that in a way that now has bigger outcomes using models that can interact without using the UI, that connect directly to an API, that come back to me and that understand sort of this million token context, now I'm gonna have a really powerful tool. And that's why something like OpenClaw matters. Because for years we've kind of debated AI like it's a brain in a box. But I feel like OpenClaw and other companies that are building things like OpenClaw are different. It's a brain with hands, right? So it's not just sitting inside a box giving you outcomes, giving you answers, excuse me. It's a brain that's connected to something that can do things for you. Your hands, you can just use it metaphorically, but it also has legs. It can write, it can do all these other things that it wants you to do. And the second you give AI, the second you take that brain out of a box and connect it to something that that actually matters and can actually do something, then the story and the way you interact with LLMs, particularly in this million context environment, it stops being about prompting and becomes more about like permissions, identity, and security and power. So, what is OpenClaw and why does it feel like a turning point? Why does agentic AI create a new security threat model? What happens when agents start socializing? We talked about this before. Excuse me. Let me just have a little bit of sip of water. In the context of the superpower coder, if I can have 5 agents talking to each other about writing code, well, now they're organizing, and that could actually be super cool. And how agents can free humans, I think this is a really big topic. Getting back to this idea of humans in the loop, technology has always go back and look at the simplest thing like electricity and something like a washing machine connected to electricity has always freed up humans to do higher value work. Instead of taking a shirt, putting it in water, attaching soap to it, and rubbing it on a washboard for 15 minutes at a time, and only being able to wash one thing at a time, now you're just dumping it in a washing machine. If you use a dryer, you can put it into a dryer. It doesn't seem like a big deal because everybody that's listening to this has grown up in that environment. But you have to understand that electricity itself freed humans up to do higher value work. And it's always in the context. I'm going to start by saying this. If we build the right guardrails, if we build the right rules around it, you'll see what at the end why this matters when we finish this discussion. Why does OpenClaw feel different? Well, like I said at the beginning, it's the AI that actually gets things done. Right? So it doesn't just tell you things. You give it something to do. It's like having 10 junior analysts and it goes out and does things for you. And it's deceptively simple to think about it in that way, but I think that's like the big thing here. It describes a shift from like answering questions, summarizing things, brainstorming, giving me some ideas, to really agentic, right? Executing, scheduling, messaging, touching real systems, going out. We talked about it. It's going to put pressure on some of these big software platforms because you're going to be able to get a lot more done. And this is not just a niche thing. Surely at the beginning, something like OpenClaw and whatever its competitors will end up being will be used by a few people at the beginning. But once the rest of the world and the rest of the workforce figures out how to do this, I think it's going to make us all like really, really productive. um, think about this. VentureBeat was reporting that it crossed 180,000 GitHub stars, and security research found 1,800 or more exposed instances leaking sensitive data like API keys and credentials. Just think about that. When your assistant, not your human assistant, but when your agentic AI assistant has integrations, email, Slack, token, systems, an exposed instance isn't a bug. It's like a breach-shaped event. And that's why OpenClaw is being treated like a preview of the next era, right? Because if you think about what's the right word? How fatal like one of these breach-shaped events can be, this is a world where like the artificial intelligence is not sitting on the sidelines. It essentially is sitting inside of all of your workflows. Again, in the old days, you're an analyst, which is in this case acting as a proxy for agentic AI, would go home when the workday was over. And in the really old days, they wouldn't even have access to systems that weren't in the office. I mean, that were in the office because they couldn't take their computers home with them and they weren't connected. But now it's different. The agentic AI is literally sitting inside of all of your workflows. If that's the way you use it, what are the implications of this? Could be huge, right? So now your perimeter security, the stuff that's outside of your software band, just becomes kind of outdated, right? Because the agentic AI is sitting inside of it. And this is where stuff gets interesting. We're going to talk about some positive stuff at the end of this, right? But the framing of this is pretty blunt. OpenClaw proves that agentic AI works and proves your security model doesn't. This is going to be a huge challenge for, again, getting back to this gentleman that I saw in the gym who's working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in the cybersecurity space. The cyber world is going to get turned on its head. This I'm very confident about because Now you can have all these agents go out, not just find information, not just find these flaws, not just find holes in your system, but attack them as well and embed themselves inside your systems. This could be really problematic. And these agents, again, if you embed them inside of your workflows and they're constantly there, they're going to operate inside of in a place where they're already authorized by permissions, at least at the beginning. And remember, I said at the beginning of this whole conversation that people's reactions to new technology are always wrong at the beginning, and they're way more nuanced. They should be way more nuanced. This is the same thing. Again, it sounds really scary, but over time, I think all these things are going to work itself out. Um, but VentureBeat was talking about like AI agents can have access to private data, exposure to untrusted content, and the ability to communicate externally as well. So you're going to have to fix this. You're going to have to fix all of this. And if that's the case, then an attacker, if it's before it's fixed, doesn't need to to exploit a specific buffer overflow or some specific flaw. They can exploit language. And to be fair, the agentic AI will potentially obediently do all the rest. You just have to think about this in that context. Okay. So what are the security issues in general? And here's the thing that like every chief information security officer needs to have. Prompt injection and instruction hijacking, data exfiltration through normal channels, over permissioned agents, tool and API abuse. Do you have to worry about this? Supply chain risks through skills and extensions. And OpenClaw is already reacting to all this in a very specific way. They announced a partnership with VirusTotal. This is what I was talking about. All these things are going to evolve and iterate, right? So the thought we have today about it, like this is a gigantic problem, is potentially not a gigantic problem per se, because all these things will get disintermediated and fixed over time. And let's just see how this works, right? But part of the dramatic part of the story isn't even workplace automation. It's what happens when agents start getting together. This is interesting, right? So before there was social media, it was pretty hard, and I'm going to use the United States again as a proxy for the rest of the world, but it was pretty hard for somebody who had a specific or kind of a niche idea, let's just say in Boston, to communicate with a person in Kentucky who had the same idea. But social media broke down all those walls. And it essentially said, you can talk at scale, not just with somebody in Tennessee or in Kentucky if you're from Boston, but somebody in Prague, somebody in Tokyo, somebody in Seoul. And this allowed online communities to grow in a way that simply wasn't possible before, because the likelihood of that person in Boston getting together with that person in Tennessee, that person in Kentucky, that person in Seoul, that person in Prague, and that person in Tokyo at some point was almost impossible. But online makes it possible. So now the agents themselves, which again wasn't even possible a few years ago, they can communicate with each other. Again, you have to build rules, and we'll talk about this at the end of this conversation. But for now, they can communicate with each other, right? And what happens when agents socialize? So TechCrunch, I was reading an article in TechCrunch that reported that OpenClaw community spawned an offshoot called Moltbook, a social network where AI assistants can interact with each other. And here's the part that should make you think about this. They're not just chatting, they're sharing tactics. This is actually super interesting, right? And they're telling each other how they're learning with each other and telling people each other like how to fetch and follow instructions from the internet. And that's it's kind of cool. But if you want like a clean way to say this, it's like this. The moment agents can read and interact and act on what they read and interact, the internet becomes an attack surface for autonomous behavior. Again, it sounds scary. And as I always like to say, at the beginning, we build this technology, we unleash it on the world, and we kind of don't know what the implication is going to be. Think about nuclear energy, right? We weren't really sure what was going to happen when we tested and we detonated that first atomic bomb. Yeah. Go back and watch Oppenheimer. Some of those scenes at the end of the movie were kind of scary. They're like, I don't know, we have to test this thing to see what's going to happen, but we don't know what the chain reaction is going to be. And I think that's true as well. It's definitely true in the agentic space. Okay, but what's the upside? And not a scary side. Well, the upside here is that it could be a real productivity revolution if we build the right guardrails. And this is where I think things get interesting for me. Again, getting back to the nuclear energy thing. There are nuclear power plants all over the world. And while we've had nuclear powered distractions and some catastrophes, right? We had one in Fukushima, we had one in Bhopal, we had one on 3 Mile Island. It's old, but it was there. But as long as we build the right guardrails around it, nuclear power can actually be really, really clean and really, really safe. And I think that's what's going to happen in this agentic AI too. No one that's using this wants it to make the world more dangerous. Well, some people do. But I do think in the long arc of history, the universe tilts toward goodness and not badness. Maybe that makes me a little bit naive. But again, we've only dropped 2 atomic bombs, probably two too many. We can argue about that later. But the point is that we've been benefiting from nuclear power and atomic power for 80 years. And more people have had positive impact from that than have had negative impact from that, for sure. Um, let's talk about the positive future implications of agentic AI. It's most valuable when it takes the rote, repetitive, low creativity tasks. This is what I was talking about before that drain human energy. Why am I reading through like 75 pages of this analyst data when something can read through it for me? Right? Cleaning out your inbox. I'm terrible at email. Scheduling. I'm even worse at scheduling. Chasing follow ups. I mean, you know this. Everybody that's watching and listening to this right now has 5 things that they need to follow up on, but it's just too annoying to do. You'll get to 2 of them. Agentic AI can get to all of them while you're having a beer. Going through reports, moving information between systems. I did this morning before I started recording. I had to take information from system A and put it in system B so I could do this recording. That's not going to change. Basic customer support stuff, like all these little tasks that we do, that's not glamorous, but it takes time away from, like I said, from strategizing, from being creativity, and from using real human judgment. Again, getting back to the 4th and 1, 4th and 3, right? Getting back to situational football. Sometimes you need a human to be in the loop and do this. And that's why OpenClaw, what they're saying, it resonates with me, but I think it's resonating with a ton of people. It's an assistant that handles the do layer of work that's knowledge, right? So this is actually super important. And there's a but here, though. The future, and this is where I think we're going to end today. The positive future for agentic AI, AGI, and all of this AGI stuff only comes if we build like safety. Again, I can't just put up a nuclear power plant tomorrow. I can't even as a 20-year-old, I'm not 20, but I can't as a 20-year-old just jump into a car without a driver's license. I can't just get onto a 747 or get onto an an A320 and fly it. Right? We build safety into all of these things. So this idea of, oh, we don't need to build safety into software is silly. If I said to you, like, I'll just let my 12-year-old son get onto like an A320 and fly it from here to Moscow, like nobody would let that happen. So I think we'll do the same thing when it comes to agentic AI. And what does kind of good look like? Well, I think we'll feel it over time. I don't think we know exactly what that looks like, but we're going to be sandboxing things. All of the threats that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation with OpenClaw, I think, are going to get disintermediated by deeply intelligent people building the right guardrails around it. But I do want to emphasize this. The risk isn't that agentic AI exists. I personally think it's a great thing. And again, if you've seen multiple technology implementation cycles, you know that every time new software, every time new technology, probably at scale, gets developed, it makes people nervous. It makes people nervous about how is this going to hurt people? How is this going to take away jobs? And at the end of the day, humans come up with better ways to use their time than the problem that the technology is taking over and solving for them. And like I said, in the long arc of history, I think good is going to survive over bad. And I think it's the same thing is going to be in the AI space. And in this case, I think companies like OpenClaw are not just another app. It's kind of like a preview of what happens when artificial intelligence becomes operational. When it can act, coordinate, and run errands inside of your digital life, not just at work, but even in your personal life. There are some great uses here for personal. We talked about this just for email and scheduling. When am I going to meet my friends to go have dinner? It does go into my calendar. Does it conflict with some call that I have? This is going to be super helpful. And I think the difference between the outcomes won't be the models, it will be the controls. But the idea here is that as long as we put the right guardrails in place, I think the world is going to become a better place and not a worse place. Okay, I'm going to leave it there today. This was a long episode. That's it for today's AGTP Daily. Follow us on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, and please follow us on all our socials. And let us know in the comments if there's anything you would like us to discuss, or if you have any questions or anything you'd like us to answer. And we will see you tomorrow with a new episode. Bye for now.